There is a version of World War I that most people carry in their heads. It involves mud and poetry. It involves young men who believed in something, who marched off in clean uniforms to a war that the newspapers said would be over by Christmas. It involves courage and tragedy and the kind of sacrifice that gets carved into stone in town squares. That version is not entirely false, but it is carefully constructed. It was constructed during the war by governments that needed more men. It was maintained after the war by the same governments that needed to explain why they had spent those men the way a factory spends raw material. And it has been passed down ever since because the alternative, the actual version, is something that most institutions have never had a strong interest in preserving. The actual version of World War I is not about courage. It is about what happens when modern industrial civilization applies its full organizational capacity to the problem of killing human beings at scale. It is about bureaucracies that learn to process mass death the way a shipping company processes freight. It is about medical systems that categorize psychological destruction as a character defect. It is about the slow, quiet, methodical way in which millions of men were fed into a machine that had no clear purpose beyond its own continuation, and how the people running that machine learned to describe what they were doing in language so neutral that it could be printed in official reports without alarming anyone. What follows is not the version of the war that gets commemorated. It is the version that got filed, stamped, suppressed, reclassified, or simply never written down at all because the people who witnessed it were either dead, institutionalized, or had learned that the price of speaking clearly was social exile. These are 22 practices from the First World War that would horrify people today, not because the war was uniquely evil, but because of how organized it was, because of how routine it became, because of how thoroughly the machinery of modern civilization was turned toward ends that no one involved seemed entirely willing to acknowledge. The first thing to understand about the trenches is that they were not built to be temporary. Every account, every memoir, every letter home in the early months of the war describes the trenches as a short-term measure, a place to pause while the generals organized the next advance. By the end of 1914, the Western Front had stabilized into a line that stretched roughly 450 miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border, and almost nobody in authority was willing to state plainly that this line was not going to move in any meaningful way for the next 4 years. The decision not to say this clearly was itself a kind of practice, a practice of managed information. The men in the trenches were not told that they were going to live in holes in the ground for years. They were told to hold the line. They held it. And the mud and the water and the rats and the cold became not a temporary emergency, but a permanent condition. And the official response to that permanent condition was to issue regulations about how the trenches were supposed to be maintained. There were British Army regulations specifying the appropriate depth of a fire step. There were regulations about drainage. There were regulations about the proper disposal of waste, even as the systems meant to implement those regulations were routinely inadequate or non-existent. The gap between the regulations and the reality was enormous, and it was documented in medical reports that were classified, in inspectors' notes that were quietly buried, in letters from officers that were censored before they reached home. The official record of the trench system presents a managed environment. The unofficial record, assembled from diaries and private letters, presents a place where men lived in standing water for weeks, where their feet rotted inside their boots, where the smell of decomposing bodies was so constant that veterans would later report being unable to identify it as a smell at all, because it had simply become the ambient condition of existence. Trench foot was one of the first medical crises of the war that the British Army treated as a disciplinary problem. The condition occurs when feet are kept cold and wet for extended periods. The blood vessels constrict. The tissue begins to die. In advanced cases, gangrene sets in and amputation becomes necessary. In the first winter of the war, the British Army recorded tens of thousands of cases. The medical response was to issue an order requiring soldiers to rub their feet with whale oil and change their socks regularly. The order was issued without any corresponding increase in the supply of dry socks or whale oil. Men who developed trench foot were, in some documented cases, charged with willful self-neglect. The logic was that if they had followed the regulations, they would not have gotten sick. That the regulations could not be followed given the actual conditions in the trenches was not addressed in the disciplinary framework. It was addressed in the medical reports, which went up the chain of command, and the chain of command issued more regulations. This pattern repeated itself across virtually every category of physical hardship in the trenches. Lice were a universal condition. Nearly every man who served on the Western Front was infested within days of arriving in the trenches. The lice lived in the seams of clothing and were essentially impossible to eradicate under field conditions. They transmitted trench fever, a disease that caused high fever, severe headaches, and incapacitation for weeks. The British Army issued guidance on delousing. The guidance involved a candle flame run along the seams, which killed the visible lice but not the eggs, which hatched within days. The men knew this. The medical officers knew this. The reports went up the chain. The guidance remained the same for most of the war, because changing it would have required acknowledging how comprehensively the men were living in conditions that no regulation could address. The second practice that defined the war, and that would be recognizable today as something close to institutional torture, was the management of shell shock. The term itself was a concession to reality that the military medical establishment immediately began trying to walk back. It was coined early in the war to describe a cluster of symptoms that frontline soldiers were presenting: paralysis without physical injury, blindness without damage to the eyes, deafness without any wound to the ear, uncontrollable trembling, inability to speak, complete psychological collapse. The early theory was that these symptoms were caused by the physical concussion of nearby shell explosions, hence the name. By 1916, the medical consensus was shifting toward a psychological explanation. The symptoms were real, but they were caused by sustained psychological trauma rather than physical brain damage. The military's response to this shift was revealing. Acknowledging that men could be psychologically destroyed by combat experience was uncomfortable because it implied that there was a limit to what men could endure, and that limit was being consistently exceeded by the conditions on the Western Front. Instead, the medical and military establishment developed a parallel set of explanations. Men with shell shock symptoms were characterized as having constitutionally weak nervous systems. They were described as lacking moral fiber. They were occasionally described as malingerers, men who were producing or exaggerating symptoms in order to avoid duty. The treatment that was developed out of this framework was not designed to address the psychological damage. It was designed to return the men to combat as quickly as possible. One of the most widely used treatments for shell shock in the British Army was developed by a physician named Lewis Yayland, who worked at the National Hospital for the Paralysed and Epileptic in London. His treatment involved the application of electric shocks to the affected parts of the body, combined with what he described as moral authority. In his published case reports, which he offered as evidence of successful treatment, he describes applying electrical current to mute patients' throats until they spoke, locking patients in darkened rooms for hours at a time, and using a combination of praise and threat to compel compliance. His patients were soldiers. They had been sent to him because they could no longer function as soldiers. His goal was to make them function as soldiers again. He considered his methods humane and his results successful. His success rate was measured by whether the men could be returned to duty, not by any assessment of their long-term psychological state. Yayland was not an outlier. His methods were published, distributed, and used as a reference point in the broader medical debate about shell shock treatment. The debate itself was highly constrained. The military needed men. The medical establishment was operating within a military framework. Papers that concluded men needed extended rest and removal from combat were not well received by the chain of command. Papers that offered rapid treatment methods that could return men to duty were welcomed. This created a pressure throughout the medical establishment to produce findings that served military manpower needs rather than patient welfare. The men who were treated knew this. Some of them said so in the rare cases where their accounts were recorded. The third practice, one that has been almost entirely sanitized from popular memory, was the execution of soldiers for military offences. The British Army executed 306 soldiers during the First World War. They were shot by firing squads composed of their own comrades. The offences for which they were executed included desertion, cowardice in the face of the enemy, striking an officer, sleeping on duty, and in some cases, simply being absent without leave. A significant number of the men who were executed were later identified by subsequent medical and historical review as having been suffering from untreated shell shock at the time of their offences. They were tried at courts-martial that sometimes lasted less than an hour. They were not always permitted legal representation. In many cases, the verdict and the sentence were predetermined by the military necessity of maintaining discipline, and the actual circumstances of the offence were secondary to the exemplary function of the punishment. The men in the units where these executions took place were required to witness them. This was not incidental. It was policy. The purpose of requiring the men to watch their comrades be shot was to reinforce the understanding that the military had the power and the will to kill them if they failed to comply. The letters and diaries of soldiers who witnessed these executions describe a particular kind of psychological damage that is distinct from combat trauma. They describe the specific horror of watching a man they knew, sometimes a man they had served with for months or years, tied to a post or a chair, blindfolded and killed by an organized group acting on official orders. They described trying to process the fact that the army that was supposed to protect them was willing to use the same violence against them that it used against the enemy. Some of them described not being able to process it at all. The official records of these executions were classified for decades. When families of executed soldiers applied for information about how their sons or husbands had died, they were often told simply that the man had died in action. The actual circumstances were withheld. The families were denied the right to grieve accurately. This was not accidental. It was policy, designed to prevent the spread of information that might undermine public support for the war. The executed men were not listed on war memorials. They were not included in the rolls of honor. They were erased from the official record of sacrifice in a way that added a specific bureaucratic cruelty to the physical cruelty of their deaths. The French army executed an even larger number of soldiers, somewhere between 600 and 700 by most historical estimates, though the records are incomplete and the true number may be higher. The German army executed approximately 150. These executions were official, documented, and recorded by the very institutions that conducted them. They were not secrets within the military. They were secrets from the public, maintained by the same mechanisms of censorship that controlled all other information about the war. The fourth practice concerns the use of poison gas, which is sometimes presented as a uniquely German innovation and a uniquely German atrocity. This is historically incorrect, and the correction is illuminating. The Germans first used chlorine gas at large scale at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. The Allied response was not to condemn chemical warfare as a practice, but to develop their own chemical weapons as quickly as possible. By 1916, all of the major belligerents were using poison gas as a routine weapon of war. The British developed their own chlorine gas capability within months of Ypres. The French had actually used tear gas before the Germans used chlorine. The development of phosgene, a more lethal choking agent, and mustard gas, a persistent blister agent, proceeded on all sides simultaneously, with each development met by counter-development. Mustard gas deserves specific attention because of the particular nature of the injuries it produced and the institutional response to those injuries. Mustard gas does not kill quickly. It is not primarily a lethal weapon. It is a casualty-producing weapon designed to incapacitate men by producing severe chemical burns to the eyes, the skin, and the respiratory tract. The burns take hours to develop after exposure, meaning men often did not realize they had been gassed until they woke up the following morning, unable to open their eyes. The blisters that formed could be large and fluid-filled and intensely painful. In severe cases, the lining of the respiratory tract would blister and begin to peel away, and death by suffocation would follow over days. But in most cases, the injuries were incapacitating rather than immediately fatal, which was the point. An incapacitated man required medical resources. He occupied a bed in a field hospital. He stretched the logistics of the medical system in a way that a dead man did not. The medical management of mustard gas casualties was a major logistical undertaking for all armies by 1917 and 1918. The reports from field hospitals describe wards full of men lying in darkness, unable to open their eyes, their skin covered in bandages over blistered skin, their breathing labored and painful. Men with mustard gas injuries sometimes took weeks or months to recover, if they recovered fully at all. A significant number suffered permanent damage to their vision. The institutional response to this ongoing mass production of chemically burned men was the development of better gas masks, better protective clothing, and better decontamination procedures, none of which fully addressed the problem, and all of which were presented in official communications as evidence that the situation was under control. The fifth practice involves the management of the dead, which is perhaps the single most revealing lens through which to understand the institutional character of the war. At the Battle of the Somme, which began on July 1, 1916, the British Army suffered approximately 57,000 casualties on the first day alone, of whom approximately 19,000 were killed outright. The planning for the battle had included estimates of casualties. The planners had looked at the numbers, processed them, and decided that the operation should proceed. The decision to proceed was not made by men who were unable to imagine what those numbers meant in human terms. It was made by men who had decided that those numbers were acceptable in the context of the overall strategic objective, which was to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. The dead from the Somme and from the other great battles of the war presented a logistical problem that the armies addressed with varying degrees of effectiveness. In the early stages of the war, there was an attempt to maintain individual burial records, to identify the dead, to notify families, and to mark graves. As the scale of the killing increased, this system collapsed. At Verdun, at Passchendaele, at the Somme, the dead accumulated faster than they could be collected, identified, and buried. Bodies were buried in shell holes by the men nearest to them, without identification. Bodies were buried in mass graves, again without identification. Bodies were not buried at all, but remained in the no-man's land between the trenches, decomposing through the seasons, becoming part of the landscape of the war. The men who lived in and around these unburied bodies developed what can only be described as a functional accommodation to their presence. Letters and diaries describe using bodies as landmarks, referring to them by informal names, stepping over them routinely. This was not callousness in the ordinary sense. It was the psychological adaptation that human beings make when they are required to function in conditions that exceed normal parameters. The men who wrote about this accommodation often expressed some awareness that it was disturbing, that there was something wrong with the fact that the presence of decomposing human remains had become routine. The awareness did not change the routine. The sixth practice is the use of child soldiers, which the romantic narrative of the war has largely erased. The British Army's minimum age for enlistment was 19. This was routinely ignored by recruiting officers who were under pressure to meet manpower quotas. Boys as young as 14 were recruited. Some of them lied about their ages and were not challenged. Some of them were challenged and their stated ages were accepted by recruiters who had reasons to be credulous. Some of them were recruited by officers who knew perfectly well how old they were and recruited them anyway. The documentary evidence for underage recruitment is extensive. Letters from boys describing their experiences, court records from cases where parents tried to get their sons discharged, parliamentary debates about the problem, which acknowledged the scale of it without producing effective remediation. These boys went to the trenches. Some of them were killed in the trenches. Some of them survived the war and came home as men in their early 20s who had spent the most formative years of their lives in conditions of extreme violence and deprivation. The psychological literature on child soldiers from subsequent conflicts describes the particular damage that combat experience causes to developing adolescent minds. There was no equivalent literature in 1914 to 1918, and no institutional interest in developing one. The boys were soldiers. They were managed as soldiers. The fact that they were children was not a category that had administrative significance in the military framework of the time. The seventh practice concerns what happened to men who survived the war and returned home with physical injuries that could not be hidden. The scale of physical mutilation produced by the war was staggering and had no precedent. Facial injuries were particularly common because men in the trenches exposed their faces above the parapet and were targeted by snipers and by fragments from artillery shells. The improvements in medical care during the war, particularly in surgery and in the management of infection through the use of antiseptic techniques, meant that men survived injuries that would have been fatal in previous conflicts. Men survived with their faces partially or entirely destroyed. Men survived without jaws. Men survived with massive burns that left their faces without recognizable features. They survived, and then they had to live in a society that had no framework for integrating them. The story of reconstructive surgery in the First World War is sometimes told as a story of medical innovation and heroism, centered on figures like Harold Gillies in Britain, who developed many of the foundational techniques of modern plastic surgery. This is accurate as far as it goes. Gillies and surgeons like him performed extraordinary work. But the scale of what they were attempting to address and the limitations of what was achievable meant that thousands of men were discharged from the war with faces that had been partially reconstructed but remained severely disfigured. These men were often given pensions that reflected the military's assessment of their disability. The pensions were routinely inadequate. The assessment process was often dehumanizing. Men were required to appear before medical boards that categorized the degree of their disability according to schedules that assigned percentage values to the loss of specific body parts and functions. There were special residential facilities and parks in Britain designated for severely disfigured veterans, places where they could exist without having to navigate public spaces where their appearance caused distress to others. These facilities were not presented as segregation. They were presented as welfare. The distinction between the two is philosophically significant and practically thin. The eighth practice is the management of information within the military hierarchy about what the war was actually accomplishing. The gap between what the generals reported to their civilian superiors and what was actually happening on the ground was significant and persistent throughout the war. This is documented. It is documented in the private correspondence of political leaders who expressed frustration with military reports that consistently described progress where progress was not occurring. It is documented in the diaries of staff officers who recorded the difference between the official version of operations and their own understanding of what had happened. It is documented most comprehensively in the work of subsequent historians who compared the official dispatches with the casualty figures and concluded that the two could not be coherently reconciled. The Battle of Passchendaele, which is the common name for the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, is perhaps the clearest example of this information management failure at institutional scale. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, commanding the British forces, was receiving reports throughout the battle about the condition of the ground, which had been churned by artillery into a landscape of liquid mud in which men and horses and equipment were literally drowning. The reports described conditions in which offensive operations were extremely difficult and in which the men were suffering enormously. Haig continued the offensive. He continued it for months. The battle produced a British advance of approximately 5 miles at a cost of approximately 250,000 British casualties. When it was over, the 5 miles were given back almost immediately in the German spring offensive of 1918. The ninth practice is the specific management of the bodies of officers versus the bodies of enlisted men. This distinction was real, systematic, and carefully maintained. Officers killed in action were, wherever possible, given individual burial with proper identification. The families of officers were notified through official channels with greater speed and greater specificity than the families of enlisted men. Officers' graves were more likely to be accurately located and marked. The graves registration units that worked after major battles to identify and bury the dead were instructed to prioritize the identification of officers. This reflects the class structure of British society operating within the military framework. It also reflects the institutional understanding that the families of officers had greater social and political power to demand accountability, and that meeting their needs was therefore a higher institutional priority. The process by which the graves of the unidentified dead were managed is a window into the bureaucratic character of the war. There are in France and Belgium cemeteries maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission that contain thousands of graves marked simply with the phrase "known unto God." These graves contain the remains of men who could not be identified. The phrase was suggested by Rudyard Kipling, who served as a literary advisor to the commission, and whose son John was among those whose remains were never definitively identified. The phrase is moving in its context. It is also, in a very literal sense, an admission that the institutional machinery of the war had consumed these men so completely that nothing remained by which they could be known to any earthly authority. The 10th practice concerns the medical category known as neurasthenia, which was used extensively during the war to classify men who displayed symptoms of psychological breakdown without displaying the more dramatic symptoms associated with shell shock. Neurasthenia was a 19th century medical concept that described a depletion of nervous energy, and it had been used before the war to describe a range of conditions associated with modern industrial life. During the war, it became a catch-all category for men who were not functioning effectively as soldiers, but who could not be conclusively diagnosed with a recognized physical or psychological condition. Men categorized as neurasthenic were often treated with rest and removed from frontline duty for a period, but the category also carried an implication of weakness, of constitutional inadequacy that affected the treatment of the men so classified and the regard in which they were held by the military system. The distinction between shell shock and neurasthenia was not clinically clear and was applied inconsistently by different medical officers. What the two categories had in common was that they were both framed in terms of individual pathology rather than in terms of the conditions producing the pathology. The question that the medical system was not asking was whether sustained exposure to artillery bombardment, to the deaths of comrades, to the conditions of the trenches, would damage any human mind regardless of constitutional strength. The question it was asking was what was wrong with these particular men that they were not coping. The answer it was generating was not particularly useful for the men themselves, but it was very useful for the military because it located the problem in the individual rather than in the system. The 11th practice is the specific way in which the bodies of dead soldiers were processed for the information they contained. The British military dog tag system was designed to allow rapid identification of casualties. Every soldier wore 2 tags. If he was killed, 1 tag was removed for the records, and 1 remained with the body. In practice, the system failed regularly. Tags were lost. Bodies were so severely damaged by artillery that identification was impossible regardless of tags. Men were buried in the confusion of battle without any documentation. But more revealing than the technical failures is what the information collected was used for. The purpose of rapid casualty identification was not primarily the humane one of notifying families. It was the military one of maintaining accurate records of available manpower. A dead man needed to be removed from the rolls so that his replacement could be processed. The notification of families was a secondary function managed by a separate administrative stream with its own delays and its own standardized language. The telegram or letter that arrived at a family home with the news of a death was a document produced by an administrative process. The language was fixed. The circumstances described were minimal. Families received notifications that their son or husband or father had died, typically with the phrase "died of wounds" or "killed in action" or some variation thereof, without any additional detail. If they wrote asking for more information, the information provided was whatever could be found in the official record, which was often sparse. Private soldiers were less likely than officers to have their last moments recorded in any documentary form, because the officers who might have observed those moments were managing dozens or hundreds of men simultaneously and could not maintain individual records of every death. The 12th practice concerns the use of propaganda and its specific targeting of women. The British government understood early in the war that voluntary recruitment could be sustained only if the social pressure on men of military age to enlist was maintained. This pressure was systematically organized through propaganda campaigns that encouraged women to view their husbands, sons, and brothers who had not enlisted as cowards. The White Feather Campaign, in which women gave white feathers as symbols of cowardice to men not in uniform, was informal in its origins, but was systematically encouraged by government propaganda. Parliamentary recruiting committee materials, explicitly addressed to women, framed the choice of men not to enlist as a failure of masculinity that reflected on the women associated with them. This campaign caused significant collateral damage. Men who had been discharged from the military due to wounds, men who were working in industries that had been designated essential to the war effort, men who had medical conditions that made them unfit for service, all received white feathers. There are documented cases of men in civilian clothes who had been severely wounded and invalided out of the army receiving white feathers from women who had no way of knowing their history. The campaign did not distinguish between these cases because it was not designed to. It was designed to produce enlistments. The psychological and social damage to the men who were targeted without justification was not a consideration in its design. The 13th practice is the systematic underreporting of wound severity in official casualty statistics. The categories used to classify casualties were constructed to serve administrative purposes. A man who was wounded and returned to duty within a certain period was counted differently than a man who was evacuated to a base hospital. A man who was evacuated to Britain was counted differently again. The effect of these categorical distinctions was that the official casualty figures, as published during the war and for some time afterward, significantly understated the actual human cost of specific operations. This was not always deliberate deception, though it was sometimes that. It was also the result of a system designed to track manpower rather than human welfare, using categories that reflected manpower concerns. The underreporting problem was most severe in the category of psychological casualties, which were handled through a medical stream that was administratively separate from the stream handling physical wounds, and that produced statistics that were more easily manipulated because the symptoms were harder to objectify. The men who passed through this stream were often recorded in ways that minimized the nature of their condition. A man diagnosed with neurasthenia might be recorded as suffering from fatigue or debility. A man with severe shell shock might be recorded under a physical diagnosis if any physical symptoms were present, because a physical diagnosis required less administrative justification and created fewer questions about why the man had been removed from duty. The 14th practice concerns the specific use of cavalry during the war, which is a subject that illuminates the nature of military decision-making in a particularly clear way. At the beginning of the war, the cavalry was the prestige branch of all the major armies. It was the branch that the socially elite officers had historically joined. It was the branch that the doctrine of the time identified as the decisive force in any major battle, the force that would exploit the breakthroughs created by the infantry and pursue the retreating enemy. The Western Front made cavalry essentially useless. The trenches, the wire, the machine guns, and the mud created conditions in which mounted troops could not operate effectively. This was obvious to almost everyone who observed the front in the first months of the war. Despite this, the cavalry was maintained throughout the war by all the major armies. It was maintained at enormous cost in terms of fodder, veterinary care, logistics, and the allocation of men who could have been deployed elsewhere. It was maintained because the generals who controlled military doctrine were cavalry officers who had built their careers on cavalry doctrine. because the institutional culture of the armies placed enormous value on the cavalry traditions, and because acknowledging that the cavalry was useless would have required a comprehensive rethinking of military doctrine, that the institutional structure was not equipped to perform under wartime conditions. The cavalry horses died in large numbers. They died of disease, of artillery fire, of the simple inability of the logistical system to keep them fed and sheltered under the conditions of the Western Front. They died in their hundreds of thousands. The men who cared for them were also casualties. The 15th practice is the management of food supply and nutrition for frontline troops. The official ration for British soldiers specified a daily allocation of food that was adequate in caloric terms under normal conditions. Under the conditions of the Western Front, the ration was regularly not delivered in full, was regularly delivered in a state that made it inedible, and did not account for the caloric demands of men living in cold, wet conditions under sustained physical and psychological stress. The soldiers supplemented their official rations by whatever means were available, including purchasing food from local civilians when they were in areas where civilians remained, receiving food parcels from home, and occasionally eating food that was technically prohibited or that had been damaged in ways that made it questionable to consume. The management of the food supply was a massive logistical operation that employed hundreds of thousands of support troops. The reports from the logistical chain describe a system that was functioning. The reports from the front line describe men who were regularly hungry. The gap between these two sets of reports reflects a recurring pattern in the institutional management of the war, in which the official record and the lived reality operated according to different logics and different categories, and the official record was the one that went up the chain of command. The 16th practice is the specific treatment of soldiers from colonial and non-European backgrounds who served in the Allied armies. The British Army during the First World War drew on the resources of its empire to a very significant degree. Indian Army troops served on the Western Front from the early months of the war. Troops from Australia, Canada, New Zealand and South Africa served in large numbers. Troops from various African colonies served, primarily in campaigns outside Europe, but in significant numbers. West Indian troops served. These men were subject to the same risks and the same conditions as European troops, and they were not treated the same way in terms of the administrative infrastructure of the military. Indian troops on the Western Front received mail and supplies through separate administrative channels that were slower and less reliable than those serving European units. The medical treatment of wounded Indian troops was sometimes segregated in ways that reflected racial hierarchies rather than medical need. The pension systems for wounded and disabled troops from the colonies were, in many cases, structured differently from those for British troops with lower payment rates. The casualty figures for colonial troops were maintained through administrative systems that were less rigorous than those for British troops, with the result that the historical record is less complete. After the war, the memorialization of colonial troops was handled differently from that of British troops. The major memorials and commemorations centered on European losses. The losses of men from the empire were honored through subordinate commemoration structures that reflected the hierarchical relationship between metropole and colony. The 17th practice concerns the medical management of venereal disease, which was a significant military problem throughout the war, and which was handled through a framework that combined medical management with moral judgment in ways that affected treatment outcomes. Venereal disease rates in the British Army were high throughout the war. The medical establishment was aware that the combination of large numbers of men under extreme stress, separated from normal social constraints in proximity to areas where commercial sex was available, would produce high rates of infection. The management of this situation was politically sensitive because acknowledging it too explicitly would have undermined the image of the morally upright British soldier that propaganda was cultivating. The approach that was adopted was a compromise between these imperatives. Soldiers who contracted venereal disease were treated, but were also subject to a stoppage of pay for the period of treatment. The financial penalty was justified as a deterrent and as a reflection of the moral responsibility of the individual for his condition. It was also, practically speaking, a deterrent to seeking treatment early, because men who knew their pay would be stopped had a financial incentive to delay reporting until the symptoms became impossible to ignore. Early treatment was medically preferable for the management of these diseases. The financial penalty therefore worked against the medical interest of both the individual and the army. This was noted in medical reports. The policy persisted. The 18th practice is the management of the psychological experience of being under sustained artillery bombardment, which was the defining sensory experience of the war for most men on the Western Front. A modern artillery barrage produces noise levels that exceed the threshold of physical pain. It produces ground vibrations that are felt throughout the body. It destroys the environment around the person experiencing it in ways that are random and unpredictable. It kills people in immediate proximity without warning. Men on the Western Front experienced artillery bombardment not as an occasional event, but as a sustained condition. Major offensives involved preparatory bombardments that lasted for days or weeks. Between major offensives, the artillery did not stop. There was what soldiers called a normal rate of fire, a background level of artillery activity that was ongoing and from which no real respite was possible in or near the front lines. The physiological effects of this sustained exposure to noise and vibration were documented in medical reports that described hearing loss, chronic headaches, inability to sleep, and what were described as nervous symptoms in men who had not been diagnosed with shell shock. The psychological effects were harder to document because the framework for documenting them did not exist. There is in the private writing of soldiers a repeated attempt to describe what it felt like to be under sustained bombardment, and the attempts are remarkably consistent in their failure to fully communicate the experience. Men write about not being able to think clearly. They write about a suspension of normal emotional response. They write about a kind of numbness that settled in after extended exposure, and that they did not entirely trust because it was not the same as calm. It was more like a temporary suspension of the capacity for full response, which they recognized as a kind of damage, even when it allowed them to function. The 19th practice involves the system of courts-martial and military discipline more broadly. The British military justice system during the First World War operated according to rules that bore only a superficial resemblance to civilian justice. Men could be tried and sentenced by officers who knew them, who had a direct stake in the outcome of the trial, and who were operating under institutional pressure to maintain discipline in their units. The right to legal representation was limited and inconsistently applied. The rules of evidence were different from civilian courts. The concept of mitigating circumstances was interpreted narrowly, and in ways that were shaped by the military's interest in deterrence. A man on trial for desertion might present evidence that he had been suffering from shell shock, and the court might accept the evidence and still impose the death penalty on the grounds that the effect of reducing the sentence would be to undermine discipline in the wider army. The field general court-martial, which was the most common form of military trial during the war, could be convened in the field within hours of the alleged offense and could proceed to verdict and sentence within a single sitting. The accused was not always present. The records of these trials were kept according to varying standards, and the completeness of surviving documentation is inconsistent. The number of men tried by courts-martial during the war runs into the hundreds of thousands. The offenses included everything from serious military offenses to minor infractions that in civilian life would not have resulted in criminal proceedings at all. The punishments included death, imprisonment, the field punishment known as Field Punishment Number 1, which involved the man being physically restrained in a fixed position for periods of up to 2 hours a day and excluded from pay, and various forms of detention and hard labor. Field Punishment Number 1 was widely used and widely considered by the men subjected to it and by outside observers to be a form of public humiliation as well as physical discomfort. Men were tied to fixed objects, often wheels or fence posts, in positions that were not painful but were awkward and exposed in view of other soldiers. The punishment was designed to be seen, It was designed to communicate to the watching soldiers what happened to men who violated military law. The men who witnessed it described it in terms that suggested it was effective as humiliation and counterproductive as deterrence, in that it produced resentment rather than compliance. The 20th practice concerns the bureaucratic processing of death on an industrial scale, which was one of the most genuinely novel features of the First World War and one of the least examined. By the end of the war, the Allied armies had developed systems for processing the deaths of soldiers that resembled in their organizational sophistication the systems that large corporations use to process financial transactions. There were standardized forms, there were processing timelines, there were escalation procedures for cases that did not fit the standard categories, there were quality control mechanisms, there were performance metrics. The graves registration services that operated on the Western Front maintained records of burial locations using a system of numbered plots and rows. When a man was buried in a registered cemetery, the location of his grave was recorded and transmitted to a central registry. When a man was buried in an unregistered grave in the field, an attempt was made to record the location and to transfer the remains to a registered cemetery when conditions allowed. The system worked imperfectly. It worked imperfectly at an enormous scale. The number of graves that had to be located, documented and registered after the armistice in November 1918 ran into the hundreds of thousands. The teams that did this work were working in a landscape that had been comprehensively destroyed by 4 years of industrial warfare, locating graves that had been marked with temporary wooden crosses or with no marker at all, in ground that had been repeatedly ploughed by artillery fire. The work of the Imperial War Graves Commission, established in 1917 and still operating today as the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, was to create a permanent, organized, maintained memorial infrastructure for the dead of the war. The scale of that infrastructure is staggering and is worth stating clearly. The Commission currently maintains over 1 million individual graves in 153 countries. It maintains 612,000 grave markers bearing the inscription known unto God. These are the graves of men who could not be identified. They represent roughly 40% of the identified graves. Combined with those who have no grave at all, the proportion of men who passed through the industrial machinery of the First World War without leaving behind any recoverable individual identity is the single most direct measure of what that machinery did to them. The 21st practice concerns the specific management of gas casualties from a perspective that is rarely examined, which is the long-term medical management of men who survived gas attacks but were permanently disabled by them. The British government's system for providing pensions and medical care to disabled veterans of the First World War was established during the war and modified repeatedly in the years following it. The pension rates were established by a schedule that assigned a percentage value to each recognized disability. The administration of this system was conducted by a government department that was under pressure to limit costs. The medical examination process that determined pension rates for gas casualties was adversarial in character. Men who believed they were more disabled than the official assessment recognized could appeal, but the appeals process favored the institutional position. Men who developed health problems years after the war that were arguably related to gas exposure found it increasingly difficult to establish the connection to the satisfaction of the pension authorities as time passed. The men who had been most severely affected, those who were permanently blinded or who had permanent respiratory damage, were relatively straightforwardly handled because their disabilities were obvious and measurable. The men with intermediate levels of disability, those whose lungs were damaged but not obviously, those whose vision was impaired but not destroyed, those whose general health had been undermined in ways that manifested as susceptibility to other illnesses, found themselves in a system that was not well designed to recognize the nature of their damage. The 22nd and final practice is the most broadly encompassing, and it is the one that connects all the others. It is the practice of treating the human cost of the war as a problem to be managed, rather than a reality to be acknowledged. The institutions that conducted the war developed, over the 4 years of its duration, a comprehensive administrative language for discussing what was happening that was functionally divorced from any direct engagement with the experience of the people it described. Casualties became statistics. The statistics were grouped into categories. The categories were processed by departments. The departments produced reports. The reports went up chains of command. The chains of command made decisions. The decisions were implemented by departments. The departments produced more statistics. At every level of this process, the connection between the administrative category and the human reality it was meant to represent was attenuated. The man who was recorded as a casualty in a battalion war diary was a man who had been killed or wounded or had broken down psychologically. The figure who appeared in the Corps Commander's daily casualty report was a number. The number that appeared in the War Office statistics was part of a ratio, a cost per objective figure, a comparative metric against the estimated losses of the enemy. The number that appeared in the national casualty figures published after the war was part of a total that had been assembled from multiple sources with varying standards of documentation, and that was known to be incomplete. The approximately 17 million people killed in the First World War, a figure that includes both military and civilian deaths, and that represents one current best estimate among several, were processed by this system at every level. They were processed before they died, when they were enlisted, trained, assigned, transported, and deployed. They were processed as they were killed or wounded or broken. They were processed after their deaths, when their graves were registered, their effects were collected and catalogued, their pensions were calculated, their families were notified, and their names were inscribed on memorials. The processing was thorough. The thoroughness of the processing was one of the things that made the scale of the killing possible, because the processing created a distance between the decision makers and the consequences of their decisions that allowed the decisions to continue being made. The armistice was signed at 11 o'clock in the morning on November 11, 1918. The fighting on the Western Front had continued up until that moment. Orders for offensive operations had been issued and were in progress. Men died in the last hours and minutes before the guns stopped. The soldiers who had been in the trenches put down their weapons and looked at the enemy across no man's land, and in some cases they simply stood in the open in large numbers for the first time in years, because there was no longer anyone shooting at them. The silence, in the accounts of men who experienced it, was the most profoundly disorienting thing they had ever heard. The war had produced, in the space of 4 years, a set of institutional practices for the management of mass death that had never existed before. Those practices did not disappear when the armistice was signed. They were written into the administrative systems that the participating governments carried forward. They were encoded in the pension frameworks and the medical protocols and the veterans organizations and the war graves registries that continued to operate for decades. They were reflected in the language that governments used to discuss military casualties in subsequent conflicts, language that had been developed on the Western Front and that was available ready to use the next time large-scale killing needed to be administered at scale. The system that had processed 17 million deaths had demonstrated that it was possible to process them. It had demonstrated the forms and the categories and the reporting structures that were necessary. It had normalized the administrative management of mass death as a function of the modern state. The armistice ended the killing. It did not end the system that the killing had built.